you say Pascal, people think
Yep.
of his famous wager.
Yeah.
What is Pascal's wager? Give us the sort of popular understanding level, and then we'll investigate.
Yeah. Well, the popular understanding of Pascal's wager is basically the argument that you might as well believe in God because the benefits are better. And you make a wager. You've got to bet one way or the other. You might as well bet on God because if you're right, then you get eternal bliss. If you're wrong, you go to hell. It's sort of like that. It sort of feels like for many people.
Well, if you believe in God and you're wrong, if you do believe in God and you're wrong, then it's like, who cares?
Yeah,
But there's so much to gain.
Yeah.
If you don't believe in God and you're right, then who cares? But there's so much to lose.
Exactly.
So you want to go for the option where you've got more to gain.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's it's an argument about most people who buy the lottery do the same sort of thing. It's a very small stake for a potential big win. If I don't win, I haven't lost very much. But if I do win, I gain a great deal. And so the argument is often thought of as Pascal saying, here is a good reason for believing in God.
Mm-hmm.
And you really ought to believe in God because of this argument. And but I actually don't think it works that way partly because, as we said earlier on, Pascal's not that convinced about, foolproof 100% reasons that force you into belief in God. The way I think it works is like this, that so it starts with probability theory. And at the start of the wager, he says, it says we are our soul is cast into the body. What he says is that our life is kind of like a game that is halfway through. In other words, at the end, we will find out there is a God or there isn't a God. We don't know at the moment. We can't quite know for certain right now. But you've got to wager on one or the other. And then it goes in the form of a kind of conversation. And I think it's like the person he's talking to is someone who is kind of in the position of thinking, well, there may be good reasons for believing in God, but maybe good reasons for not believing in God, slightly poised between the two, not quite sure which way to go. And so Pascal says, well, life is like this. You got to bet one way or the other. And so the guy says to Pascal, well, do I have to bet? Can I just be agnostic? And Pascal says, oh, no, you have to bet because you are already living your life as if God doesn't exist, or if God does exist. You've already bet. You're already embarked on the journey, is the language he uses. And the question is, are you going to change sides? There isn't a sort of side in the middle. And so Pascal says, well, yep, you've already bet. You're already one side or the other. And so the guy then says to Pascal, well, is there any evidence to push me one way or the other? And Pascal says, well, there is, but it's not 100% conclusive. It's not a watertight argument to go one way or the other. And so the guy says, well, what do I do then? And that's when Pascal brings in this quite intricate bit of argument about probability, where he goes into this thing and saying, well, if you believe that God exists and you're wrong, well, you haven't lost a great deal, maybe a bit of sacrifice in this life, but our lives are very short in the concept of eternity, and you haven't lost a great deal. If you're right, you stand to gain a great deal, eternal bliss in heaven. If you bet on God not existing and you're right, well, again, you haven't gained a great deal, just a few years of pleasure on this life, but then into nothingness or whatever. But if you're wrong, you stand to lose a great deal, eternal damnation or annihilation or whatever the conclusion is. So basically what he says then is, look, if you were being really irrational about this, if you were really calculating the odds, you'd always bet on belief. But then the guy comes back and says, but I can't make myself believe something I don't believe. I can't feel it. And that's where Pascal says, yeah, I get that. I can see why you can't do that. And this is when the key point comes in the wager. Pascal says, well, at least get it into your head that the reason you don't believe is not because of your reason, it's because of your passions. In other words, what he says is, if you were really being rational, you'd bet on belief, because that's where the odds tell you. That's the good bet. But the fact that you don't shows that the real reasons for unbelief are not rational. They're more instinctive, back to this idea of the heart. And it's to do with your passions, not your reasons. So what he's trying to do is uncover the real foundations of belief and unbelief. And it's not primarily about rationality, which is what Descartes thought it was. Now then, there comes an interesting move because, again, the guy says, well, what do I do then? And Pascal says, well, the way to find faith, if you're in this position where it may be true, maybe not true, you can see there are reasons why, but you can't quite feel it and so on. Pascal says, well, you do what pretty well every Christian has always done, which is to act as if you did believe. And so he says in the text, he says, go to Mass, take holy water, the sort of Catholic actions of the time. We might say, well, start reading the Bible as if it is God speaking to you for that day. Start going to church as if it really is the place where God's people gather. Start praying as if God is listening, even if you're not sure whether he is or not. Start treating each person you meet each day as if they were someone made in God's image and someone incredibly sacred and precious because they are God's gift to you in that moment. In other words, start to live as if it was true, even before you're sure it is. And then he says, that process of habit, because that's the way we're made as human beings, we learn things by habitual action as much as by reason and everything else. Gradually, you will gradually begin to realize it does kind of make sense. It suddenly falls into place when you act in that way. Because what you do is you start to learn to look at the world with a whole new set of eyes, and then it begins to fall into place for you. And that's his recommendation as to how you then find faith, given the way in which things work. So, sort of the long explanation.
Yeah, but it deserves it because it's important. He says, maybe in this context, maybe in another, he says something like, first convince men that Christianity is desirable, then convince them that it's true.
Yeah.
And okay, fair enough. And I think, and Pascal's wager has got a lot of attention as of late because it's been quite resoundingly mocked and ridiculed by atheists.
Yep.
And then just recently, I think people, particularly online, have been trying to be like, no, like it's more subtle. It's more, and to the extent that if you ever mention Pascal's wager, I often get, I think you'll see a lot of Christians being like, no, you don't know, it's not what you think it is. But I think even with this clarification, people are still going to look at this and find it a little bit strange for a few reasons. Firstly, it does feel decidedly fake it till you make it.
Yep.
And maybe that's fine. I mean, Pascal, the criticism is, I can't choose what I believe.
Yep.
And Pascal says, well, not directly, exactly, but if you start living in a particular way, you are more likely to become convinced of it. So it's sort of a way of choosing your belief. So yeah, it's fake it till you make it, but only once you've sort of already agreed that faking it, as it were, would be the better thing were it possible. Okay, fine. But there are all kinds of other issues with this line of thought for people, right? So the first thing people say is, I can't choose what I believe. Then they might say something like, okay, maybe there is actually quite a lot to lose from betting on God and it being false, because I would have to give up a great deal of the way that I live my life. I might, if I really wanted to live like a Christian, maybe that would involve cutting people out of my life that I love and care about who are bad influences. I have to give up my Sundays, maybe the time that I spend in prayer and whatnot. I give away my money like Jesus did, and now I can't, do the projects I want to do. It's quite big. But also, it's not like there's only one way to believe in God. You can see a Muslim saying the same thing. You could say a Hindu saying the same thing about belief in Brahman. Do you think, with this slightly more subtle, properly characterized version of Pascal's wager, that it is susceptible to the, okay, but which God? Because, if I believe, I think the only thing worse than atheism in a lot of religious traditions is worshipping the wrong God. If you're a Muslim, not believing in God is a pretty bad thing. But worshipping something that is not truly God is like the worst sin you can possibly commit. So speaking to Pascal, I might say, well, if I worship your Christian God and I'm wrong and Islam is true, then I'm on the lowest level of hell. So what do you think he would say to that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, I think it's why I think the wager comes within the whole pensée, and it would have, scholars argue, should it come at the beginning, would it come in the middle, would it come at the end, and you can...
Because again, these notes are just sort of notes. They're not sort of edited by Pascal.
Yeah, they're kind of edited. They're in a sort of order. Some of them are in their order, half of them are, the others are all scattered all over the place. And so we don't really know where it would have come in the argument. But there's a lot more to the pensée than just the wager. So there is actually quite a long section where he does, or there's quite a number of fragments where he does talk about this business about other religions, and he's quite interested in it. He's quite interested particularly in Judaism and Islam, which are the two religions he was particularly aware of at the time. And so you're absolutely right. Just taken on its own, what's called the many gods objection can be something which you can say, well, that argument on its own could lead you to the God of Jesus, or could it the God of Muhammad or Moses or whatever. But there's a section, I think, in the Pensée where he would have looked at what are the alternatives here. And he does this section where he looks at Judaism and he looks at Christianity and he looks at Islam. And he kind of encourages you to kind of look at those quite closely and think, well, which of these actually does speak to the human heart more than the others? And this is an argument that doesn't come within the wager. It's another part of the Pensée.
Yeah.
And his argument is, and again, you may or may not buy it, but he argues that the heart of Christianity is what he called the order of charity. It is about creating, or at least enabling people to become people of charity, of love. And so he thinks about Islam, and one way you could put it would be to say, if you like, the predominant statement of Islam is God is great.
Yeah.
The predominant statement of Christianity is God is love. And he kind of almost asks, well, which of those speaks to the human heart more? Which do we need more? Do we need a great God who gives us commands to live, or do we need a God who is love, who approaches us and who draws us into a relationship with love with him and with others? And he said, well, for him, it's the latter. Again, with Judaism, he talks about how the Old Testament, you can interpret it literally, predicting a Messiah who will come and kind of release Israel from its foreign yoke, a bit like a kind of prime minister of the modern state of Israel. Or you could read it figuratively, pointing towards a Jesus who, a Messiah who will release the human race, not from physical enemies, the Roman Empire or the Greeks or whatever, but from sin and selfishness and tragedy and sadness and everything else. And he thinks that, well, that's kind of what we need. So he appeals to again, that deep sense of instinct that he thinks people have, that longs for a God of love and compassion rather than a God of might and law and military conquest. And I think that's where he does his argumentation as to which God you're talking about and why he thinks the God of Jesus Christ is the one that makes sense and meets the human heart, if you like. And I think that's a large part of the way in which Pascal does his argumentation. I mean, as a scientist, he was very committed to the experimental method. You do experiment, you get the data, and you work out what's the best explanation for that. And he does the same in a way in the Pensée. He says, well, let's look at the human condition. This strange mixture of greatness. We have this capacity to understand the world, and yet we are tiny, insignificant bits of scraps of life in a vast universe. And he's writing in the context of the invention of the telescope, where suddenly we're aware of how small we are. And he talks about how, we desire happiness, but it slips through our fingers. We have this idea of happiness, but where does that idea come from? How do you explain this strange thing that is humanity? And that's where he begins to sort of say, well, actually, it's Christian faith that speaks to that in a way that other things don't. And so that's kind of the way he does his arguments, I think.
See, for me, these kind of function independently of each other. And maybe had he had more time, Pascal might have tied these together more explicitly. But I think, okay, fair enough. All things considered, if you're like, I want to figure out which of these religions speaks to me the most. Yeah, okay, Christianity, cool. Yeah. But then in the context of an argument which basically says, you're just making a rational analysis of the possible outcomes and then choosing which one gives you the best bet. It's not like, we're going to bet on Christianity because it's got the best evidence or whatever. It's like bet on religion or theism because it has the best outcome.
Yep.
And I'm like, okay, I understand why you might have some reasons to favor Christianity over Islam or something like in a different context. But in this gambling, if I'm just trying to be probabilistic, and I think to myself, okay, let's put it this way. When I've asked people in the past, would you take say 10 minutes of the most unbearable suffering imaginable, if it meant that afterwards you get to then have 10 minutes of the greatest possible bliss. And a lot of people actually say, I wouldn't. They say, it's almost like the suffering is weighted more. Like suffering is more bad than bliss is good, right? And so my sort of wager of outcomes here is like, say we're believing in the Christian God, right? If I believe in the Christian God and I'm wrong, you want to say, well, it costs nothing. Unless Islam is true. Supposing we're talking about that kind of context, and if I bet on Christianity and I'm right, I get eternal bliss. And if I'm wrong, I get eternal damnation, right? If I don't bet on Christianity and I'm wrong, I might get eternal damnation. But if I'm right, if I don't bet on Christianity and I'm right, then sort of nothing really matters. And so I'm kind of comparing not like the bliss of God versus, you haven't really lost much, but versus like eternal damnation. And in those contexts, I might be just more motivated to like avoid eternal damnation at all means possible. I'd rather be like an agnostic who can come to God and say, look, punish me for my indiscretion here, but at least I didn't worship the wrong thing. And the perfectly rational person might say, to avoid that eternal suffering at all costs, I need to retain that ability to face God and say, I'm just here. I'm just coasting through. I wasn't committing shirk and worshipping the wrong thing. You know what I mean? And it's all very well and good saying, well, you've got good reason to think Christianity might be true, but if I'm wrong about that, that's not gonna convince God that I should be let off for worshipping the wrong thing.
Yeah, but I think that depends on if you think the wager is fundamentally an argument to argue you into the Christian God, which I don't think it is.
Right.
I don't think that's its point. Its point is not to say, you had better bet on the Christian God because if you don't, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
So I think its purpose is a specific part of the argumentation for Pascal, which is why it may well have come early on in the argument. It's not the clinching argument for him.
Yeah, sure.
It's more trying to kind of uncover the real things that are going on in our choice of belief, whether for atheism or theism or Christianity or Islam or whatever. What's fundamentally going on is not a primarily rational thing. I think it's an argument directed primarily at Descartes and the followers of Descartes, a lot of whom were the people he was writing for.
Sure.
That is actually saying to them, what's going on here is not fundamentally a rational thing, even though you say it is.
Yeah.
It's the decisions are made on other grounds, and therefore he wants to move them onto other grounds to say, well, okay, there are other reasons why you might want to do this, and that's
and then he wants to say, like, recognize that the reasons are more emotive, they're more feelings based, and then try to bring about those emotions in yourself by living in a particular way. And so, like, I'm kind of imagining another objection here, in that I guess we're sort of running the gauntlet of Pascal wager objections, but another one that's a little bit more sophisticated is one that's based on the abuse of infinity. The fact that so long as you say, well, look, you've got infinite bliss on offer and not that much to lose, and in the face of infinity, this small sacrifice is definitely worth it rationally, I feel like you could construct loads of situations like that. Like, I could say there is a small possibility that one day artificial intelligence will grow clever enough to essentially wipe out all physical matter, take human beings' consciousness and upload it into the cloud. And suppose that, AI wants to thank people who've been, instrumental in its creation. And so everyone who's like somehow invested in artificial intelligence technologies, this future AI is more likely to take them, upload them to the cloud, and give them a sort of infinite bliss in the sort of non-physical digital future, right? So all you've got to do to just hedge your bets and make sure that you protect yourself in that scenario is just, invest £5-10 a month in artificial intelligence development, right? And you might say, but I just, a bit unlikely. I just don't think it matters that much. And I'm like, okay, but it's possible. And the possibility that we're considering here is like infinite bliss, right? And all you've got to do is bet 5 to it's nothing. You basically lose nothing. Whereas if you're wrong about this, look at what you've missed out on. For what? For £5-10 a month, a year, whatever. And yet most people would look at that and go, that's just abusing the concept of infinity with an unlikely scenario to make me do something that I don't want to do. And for many people, Pascal's wager feels a bit like that. It feels like a con.
Yeah. And I think what Pascal would say to that, two things. One is I mean, but back to his point about, the possibility or otherwise of agnosticism, and his the thing earlier on, when his conversation partner says, well, can't I just be agnostic about this? Can I just sit on the fence? And Pascal says, no, vous êtes embarqué. You've already embarked on the journey. You're on the journey. You're living your life in a particular way. And it's not a matter of, intellectual belief. I believe in God or I don't believe in God. It's about how you live your life. And you are living your life in one way or the other on the basis that God exists or that God doesn't, or that, or as you say, or the God of Jesus exists, or the God of Muhammad exists, and so on. So we've already made a choice. And so I think he's questioning to what extent, and the difference between that and the kind of AI scenarios, you could make that better, or you could not do. You could just sit on the fence on it. And I think Pascal is saying, well, it's not quite straightforward like that in the question about belief. And I think the second thing he would say is that yes, and he does say that on the one hand, there are some sacrifices involved in Christian life, but there's a bit towards the end of the pensée where he actually talks about the benefits of faith. And he actually talks about certainly, within the Night of Fire, there's a great note of just sheer joy that comes through it. This sense of, joy, certainty, trust. And he says that Pascal has, towards the end of his life, on the one hand, there's this very ascetic kind of identification with the poor, which in one sense you think is just stripping away all the things that we kind of enjoy, luxury and food and sensation and so on. But somehow in that he finds a kind of profound happiness that he's never sort of found before. And he actually does think that in this experiment of Christian life, there is a real joy to be found in it. And it's one of the big themes of Pascal. He says, everybody seeks happiness. No exceptions. We're all wanting to be happy. And yet happiness slips through our fingers whenever we grasp it.
Yeah.
And that's because he thinks that ultimately we were made as human beings to find our happiness in relationship with, in an encounter with the God who made us. And we will, and again, the classic Augustine thing, our hearts are restless till we find our rest in you. And so he does think, yes, there are some sacrifices, and that can be the most apparent when you're considering the bet of belief. Yeah. What you don't realize is that when you do make that step, there are all kinds of joys and pleasures to be found, not necessarily the ones you think are pleasures right now, but they're there waiting for you before you even know them.